Good afternoon. I'm Kerry Marsh, and over here is Tamara Schneider, if you'd wave. We're the program directors for social psychology program at the National Science Foundation. The social psychology program sits within the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate, and we're within the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences Division. And I mention that because what you might want to notice is to the left is the Social and Economic Sciences Division as well. And that's useful to be aware of because there are also programs in there that might be relevant to your own research in terms of potential funding. Our annual budget has held steady for the last several years. We anticipate spending about $6.7 million in social psychological research. People often ask us what particular projects are you looking for, and what we would typically say is that we're really looking to fund the best cutting-edge social psychological research across a broad area of topics, and we are typically looking for those to come into us in the January and July target dates in our program. Usually we'll have about 65 to 100 proposals that we'll be reviewing in any of those cycles. Our funding rate has been about 12 to 18% in recent years, and the typical length of a grant proposal can vary from 1 to 3 years or even 5 years for career proposals, but the average duration has been about 3 years. So for instance, the typical budget as well for the 3-year grants has been $350,000 of direct and indirect costs for a 3-year grant in 2014. So that gives you a little bit of background about the kind of context of social psychology funding. Most of the proposals that we would typically fund are standard research grants. There are a number of other ones, Rapid, Eager, and then near the bottom, the Inspire, that if you're submitting one of these, you would definitely need to have talked with us beforehand. And I would encourage you, as Bill encouraged you, that you would always talk to us in general to get feedback about your ideas. But for Rapids and Eagers and Inspires, they are reviewed in a somewhat different way. So a Rapid, for instance, is a 1-year grant that's in response to some sort of pressing, time-urgent event that cannot really wait for the normal kind of review cycle. And Eager is an early concept grant. Now that sounds a little bit like more of a pilot project, but it's not so much that as the idea that you have such a innovative, novel sort of idea that you believe it, there aren't experts in social psychology who can review it, so you would talk to us about this idea and reviewing it in a different way. RUI are very much like standard proposals, except that if you're at an institution that doesn't typically have PhD students, this gives you an opportunity to present to reviewers an additional document that gives them a little bit of background about your typical teaching and research context of your own research. Inspires are projects where you have this really novel idea that really crosses multiple directorates, that crosses not just our directorate, but another directorate. And you would talk to 2 different program directors from directorates to discuss that idea with us. Career are grants for faculty who are not yet tenured. This is the most prestigious grant for NSF you could get as untenured faculty, because they're 5 years. You also talk in these grants about integrating research and teaching. And I also want to point out that we also do fund things like workshops. So you want to think about a year ahead if you're trying to get some funding from NSF for a workshop, please talk to us about that idea. When you're thinking about funding your own research team, think not only about social psychology program, but encourage you to think if you do judgments under uncertainty, law and social science type research, or you do research that has implication for underrepresented groups in STEM contexts, you might be aware of other kinds of funding opportunities in addition to the social psychology program. I'll talk in a minute about funding your graduate students directly and the special postdoc programs that our directorate has. But you may also want to think about your research in terms of any other kinds of disciplines that connect to it, and I'll talk a little more about that. Finally, I would point out that we also have some particular initiatives. If you collaborate with researchers in Israel and UK, we have opportunities where you submit one grant from your international team to both countries simultaneously, and you have a split budget across the two countries, and it's otherwise reviewed in a way that's very much like our typical review process. For graduate students, the very first item is for graduate students at the very beginning of your career, the very prestigious NSF Graduate Research Fellowships that you would apply for early in graduate school. During graduate school, if you're proposing research in 7 countries that are in East Asia and Pacific, you may be interested in this middle item. And then late in graduate school, it might be useful for you to be aware of that there are a number of programs that do offer doctoral dissertation research improvement grants. We don't have funds in social psychology specifically for this, but there are a number of related programs that social psych grad students often are successful in, like decision risk management science and so forth. For postdoctoral research fellowships, the directorate funds 2 different kinds of tracks of postdocs. If your research is in the science of broadening participation, for instance, you might consider this track. If you, after graduate school, want to go on to get some specialized training that goes beyond your graduate school training, you might apply for an interdisciplinary track for a postdoc. And I think people are often not aware of these postdoc opportunities, so I really encourage you to consider them. Those applications are due in late October. If you're a faculty member, there are also opportunities within SBE Directorate to fund your interdisciplinary project. These require senior teams of 2 or 3, at least 2 different research areas, very different kinds of areas within SBE, and you need at least 3 senior faculty that are collaborating on a project. And what's interesting about these is we fund both more medium-sized grants of $300,000, but also projects that are a longer scale of up to 5 years that are $1 million. And that can be on any topic, but year to year we might be particularly looking for some specific topics, like in 2015, but it's not restricted just to the topics, for instance, of last year of technology, media, social networks, disparities. And so that's something to have on your radar. And those deadlines in the next few years would be early in December. So when you're thinking about your research, what you want to, and matching them to NSF programs, thinking about social psychology program, of course, more broadly, but also you might think about, if I do research in discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping, to have on your radar that we often might have opportunities that have to do with the science of broadening participation. Here's one example of if you were collaborating with geosciences in your university to increase diversity in that program, that may draw social psychologists in as well. If you're a social neuroscientist, you're probably already aware of President Obama's brain initiatives and how those translate to specific solicitations at NSF. So the neural and cognitive systems, the computational cognition programs as well. We've heard a lot at the conference about big data. So if you really focus on big data, I would encourage you to take a look at the Rider, which is deadline comes up at the end of February. And this is offering big funds to create large-scale data sets that may have the potential to really impact the field in significant ways. If you do tech-centered kinds of research, and maybe in the health area or in collaboration with health researchers, you might want to be aware of something like a solicitation of smart and connected health. And so these are just some examples of how to think about the different kinds of programs at NSF and their match to your particular research. So you've figured out where to send your proposal to. Other question then is, how are they going to be evaluated? They would always be evaluated on 2 fundamental criteria. One, most obvious, is the intellectual merit. How much is it going to potentially impact our knowledge in our field? Is it well-reasoned, sound rationale, creative, original, potentially transformative? But you would always also need to think hard about the potential broader impacts. How might conducting this research impact society as well? I would say in terms of tips for getting funded is obviously having a good theory. That should not be a surprise to you. It may also be useful to realize that reviewers will often want to see some evidence that you have a promising idea. Do you have some pilot data that suggests this is a good avenue to go? You want to be novel and integrative. You want to really be up to date on the cutting edge research. Design studies that really unpack the underlying mechanisms and tell you something about why some phenomena is. But in addition, you'd also want to think hard about your broader impacts. I think we're pretty good at doing this in social psychology, but that's something you'd want to make sure you articulate. I would also say you want to be persistent. It's not unheard of to be funded the first time you submit a proposal to NSF, but it's much more common that someone gets not funded the first time and submits a revision, or submits a second revision and is funded at that point. But you'd also want to be judicious. So if you're trying to sort out, after you get reviews back, whether to pursue this or not, what we'd encourage you to do is always talk to the program director. Bill said it very well. We're really there because we're trying to get the very best social psychological research, and that we want to get that to us and to fund. So we're trying to help you do that. Also, I would say, ask colleagues for examples of successful proposals. Bill mentioned this as well. I would say as well, please, if we send you a request to review a proposal, we've really thought hard about that and have see you as a particular expert who really can provide us useful information. We are looking not only for the most senior faculty in the field to give us feedback on proposals, but we're always looking for new PhDs as well to really broaden the base of our reviews. So talk to us if you're interested in having opportunities to potentially review. And finally, I would just reiterate really what Bill said, and that's not to be shy. You really do want to talk to program directors. I know when I was on the other side, I didn't tend to do that. I would know now that it really is something we encourage you to do. Now, finally, this year what we wanted to do was give you some living, breathing evidence that we really do fund people by having a new grantee come up and talk a little bit about the experience on her side. And if there's time, perhaps later, you can ask us additional questions. But this is Janet Tomiyama from UCLA.
Thanks, Kerry, and also thanks, Tamara. I'm so happy to be here to share my story with you because I came to this very session, I think, a couple years ago, and I'm here on stage, so it can indeed happen to you. And so I'm happy to be here and pay it forward. My proposal specifically was on weight stigma and testing a sort of cyclic theoretical model where someone experiences weight stigma. That turns into stress. Stress turns into cortisol, which makes you eat more and gain weight, and that could put people at risk for more weight gain and then more weight stigma, so this vicious cycle sort of concept. And so I was funded under the career mechanism, which is for junior faculty who don't yet have tenure. And the grants really do require this integration of research and education. So it's a little bit different from a normal standard grant. And that was the first thing I wanted to say, which is just because you are pre-tenure, it doesn't mean you have to apply for this career mechanism. There's some questions that you might want to answer that don't necessarily require 5 years of funding. Career is also interesting in that there's a budget minimum rather than a budget maximum, and so depending on the scope of your project, you might be better off applying through a standard grant, and in fact, that's what I did initially, and so I'll tell you about that a little bit more. And then again, that the career really does require a serious integration of research and education, so if that's not quite your priority at that moment, it might not be the appropriate mechanism. And so how it all started was I had a conversation with Sally Dickerson, who is the former program director at NSF, and we had a really great and useful conversation about my grant proposal, because some of the things I was looking at, like weight gain or cortisol or stress, could conceivably be considered under the purview of NIH and what Bill does in terms of health mechanisms. And so Sally really helped me think through what is the contribution of my idea? Is it to advance basic social psychological theory in understanding stigma, or is it trying to beneficially affect these health outcomes? And so what I really wanted to do was focus, and in terms of a grantsmanship perspective, really push and make very clear the theoretical contributions of my work, because it could potentially straddle the line between the two agencies. And so I actually initially applied under the standard grant mechanism in January of 2013, I believe. And the feedback came back just in time for me to repackage it as a career proposal. The career proposal only has one deadline per year in July. It's the July deadline. And you only have 3 chances to go for it. I was not funded on my first go-around, but I was funded on my second go-around. And so that was helpful because I had sort of the reviews from my standard grant that I could incorporate into the career proposal. And the main thing I want to say is that the reviews that I got from NSF were so high quality, really insightful, incisive, and numerous, and clearly from experts in the field. And so this isn't like when you're trying to publish a paper and there's an awful reviewer too who like clearly has not read your paper. Every single review I got back, I was like, yeah, that's right, I do need to address that. And so they're enormously helpful. And what I didn't realize is that this conversation continues even after you get the phone call saying, we're provisionally funding you. There was still another round of really refining and increasing the rigor of my studies so that to sort of improve the chances of success of it. And so my first sort of take-home message is this whole process from start to end, 2 to 3 year process, was so useful. I think I grew a lot in terms of my theoretical and scientific rigor. The studies themselves, the designs got better. Thanks to this process, I think my chances of success of this science is much higher. And also, of course, I'm just thrilled because this is going to help me get tenure. And isn't that the most important thing? And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that even after I was funded, I had this hopefully unusual experience, I'm not sure, where my work was sort of targeted by a conservative media outpost under the heading of government waste. So sort of their message was, why are we spending, or why are we wasting taxpayers' money asking fat people about their feelings? And so I got contacted by the journalist, and she said, what's your comment? Please justify why we should be spending money on this. And I panicked, but then quickly contacted Tamra and said, what do I do? And NSF just swung into action. She contacted NSF's media relations office, and together we put together a strategy. Do I respond? If I respond, how should I respond? What should I have ready to say? And so I definitely felt like not only have they funded my research and made my science better, but also sort of swung into action as mama bear when I was in trouble. And so I really can't say enough about the NSF in this whole process. So thank you.